Hey class, today we're going to talk about absolute value. Now, absolute value is a pretty different expression, and what it's always talking about is the absolute value is telling us the distance away from zero on a number line. An absolute value is always represented by these two vertical lines around the quantity that it's talking about, okay? So, if we're looking at this number line right here, and we know absolute value is the distance away from zero on a number line, first we want to find the absolute value of negative 2. So we're going to start at 0, we're going to look at negative 2, and we're going to say how far, what's the distance that is away from 0 on our number line. So negative 2 is going to be 1, 2 spaces away. So the absolute value of negative 2 will be that distance, which is 2 spaces. So the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. Okay? Now the same idea for the absolute value of 2. Let's look for 2 on our number line. 2 is right here. How many spaces away from 0 is that? That's 1, 2 spaces away. So again, that is a positive 2 spaces away. Distance is always positive, so the absolute value of the positive 2 will also be 2. So the absolute value of negative 2 is 2, absolute value of 2 is 2. That tells us that distance is always positive. Well, what does this look like if we have variables? Right here I have the absolute value of x equals 2, and I want to know what is x. That's really interesting. Up here we actually had numbers to look for, but now I don't. I want to figure out what could possibly be my x value. What numbers are 2 spaces away from 0 on my number line? I think we just found some. So let's start at 0 again, and I'm going to erase what we have so we can do this again. Okay, so starting at 0, we want to find what is 2 spaces away from 0 on our number line, because that's what absolute value is, the distance from 0. So starting at 0, let's go 2 spaces to the right. 2 spaces to the right is right here. That's 2 spaces, and that is the number 2. So x could be 2. But is that the only thing that's 2 spaces away? I don't think so. So we went to the right 2 spaces, but we can also go to the left 2 spaces. To the left 2 spaces is negative 2. So x could also be negative 2. Well, if you don't believe me, let's check our answer. Plug them back in. The absolute value of 2 equals 2. We know that from up here. And the absolute value of negative 2 equals, plugging it in, we still get 2. So x could be either 2 or negative 2 to give us an absolute value 2. And you can see our answer right down here. So building on that idea, now we're going to talk about what does this look like in a little bit longer of an equation. So absolute value equations look like this. This says 4 times the absolute value of x minus 5 equals 12. And we've got a few steps that we need to copy down to make sure we know how to do absolute value equations. Now our first step, step number 1, says isolate the absolute value. Now that's kind of a tricky thing to visualize. We're not just isolating the variable first, we're isolating the whole absolute value part of the equation. So right down here I rewrote this so that just the absolute value part, the part we need to isolate, is written in blue. So together we're going to isolate this part alone and get rid of everything else, okay? So we want that on one side of the equal sign by itself. And of course we're always going to use inverse operations. Okay? So again, this says 4 times x minus 5 equals 12. Since it's times x minus 5 and I'm using inverse operations to isolate this, I'm going to divide by that number 4 on both sides. 4 divided by 4 is going to get rid of that. So now I'm going to bring down the x minus 5 that I have left over equals 12 divided by 4 is 3. Okay, now we have isolated the absolute value. Step 2 says remove the absolute value bars and make two equations. Okay? So what we're going to do here is we're going to get rid of these bars and we're going to set this equal to 3 and to -3. The reason we're going to do that, if you remember from before, the absolute value of anything can be the positive or negative version of that number. Just like the absolute value of x before was 2 or -2, this will be 3 or -3. So the next step in this problem looks like this. No more absolute value bars. I get x minus 5 equals 3 and x minus 5 equals -3. Okay, so notice I have the positive and negative version of that answer. Our last step says solve each equation. So all we have to do now is solve. I can see my constant is a -5. The inverse of -5 is +5. And I'm going to get x equals 3 plus 5 is 8. Over here I'm going to do the same thing. I have x minus 5. The inverse of minus is plus. Plus 5 on both sides. -3 plus 5 is going to give me 2. And those are my two answers. So x could equal 8 or 2. And we'll write our answer like this. X equals 2, 8. And that's how you solve an absolute value equation. Don't forget your inverse operations. Alright. Next up, we've got the absolute value inequality. Well, if you guys remember from Friday, the difference between inequalities and equations is not very big, right? Most of the time we're doing exactly the same thing. As you can see, before we had 3 steps, now we've got 4, so there's not many differences. There are just 2 small differences in this one from the last one. Alright, the first thing is exactly the same. Isolate the absolute value. Well, this looks like almost the same problem. So we're going to isolate the absolute value the same way. We have 4 times x minus 5, so we're going to divide by 4 on both sides to get the absolute value by itself. So I get the absolute value of x minus 5 is less than 12 divided by 4 is 3. Our next step is very similar. Remove the absolute value bars and make 2 inequalities. We're going to use 3 and -3. Now the only difference here is we're going to flip our inequality when we make 2 different ones. So our first inequality will look like this. X minus 5 is less than 3. Our next one, we're going to switch our sign and we're going to flip our inequality. So we'll get x minus 5 is greater than -3. Third step is exactly the same. We're going to solve these. So we're going to add 5 to each side here. And x is less than 8. And over here we're going to add 5 to each side. And we get x is greater than 2. Now, just like on equations, we have that one last step. We have to graph these. Okay? So I'm going to draw my number line. I'm going to find 8 and 2 on my number line. I've got 2 here, 8 here. We can see that this is less than, this is greater than, but neither of them are equal to. So these will both be open circles. So I'm going to put an open circle at 2 and an open circle at 8. Alright, so it says x is less than 8, so I'm going to look for 8. 8's right here. It says x is less than that, so that means my line must be going to the left from 8, because it's less than. To the left on a number line is less than. This one says x is greater than 2, so I got to find 2. 2 is right here. It says x is greater than 2. Greater than is to the right, so that line must be going to the right. And as we can see, our 2 lines will connect. And the possible values of x are between here and here, between 2 and 8. Now you know how to solve absolute value equations, inequalities, and you know what absolute value means. You're all set to go.